I told them that I can't go back to my country. So she insisted. I said, do you want me to go and die in my country? She said, yes, you better go and die in your country.
The United States granted asylum to 25,270 people in 2007, protecting them from human rights violations in their home countries. Sadly, thousands of asylum seekers suffer routine violations of their human rights here in the United States during the asylum process. How does this happen? Before tackling this question, it is important to understand some basic information on asylum.
Asylum is a form of relief recognized by both international and domestic law in the United States that provides protection for individuals who are fleeing persecution in their home countries. And the individuals must establish essentially 4 or 5 elements. We have to show and demonstrate that they have a well-founded fear, and it's a well-founded fear of persecution based on one of the 5 categories. Those 5 categories are race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. And they have to show that the government is unable to protect them or is unwilling to do so.
Asylum has its origins in Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The subsequent 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees and 1967 Protocol relating to the status of refugees are international treaties that articulate the commonly understood definition of asylum.
And then subsequently in 1980, the United States recognized under the United States Code the Refugee Act and essentially adopted the international definition of a refugee.
While the United States sought to promote human rights by adopting the international definition of asylum, other aspects of U.S. immigration law directly undermine this effort. Of the 30,000 immigrants in detention centers and jails throughout the country, between 10 and 13% are asylum seekers. Many are detained as soon as they enter the country.
They can come, for example, through a port of entry, such as the border or an airport, and have fraudulent documents, such as a fraudulent visa or a fraudulent passport. And so they're immediately detained by immigration officials.
Asylum seekers are often forced by circumstances to use fraudulent documents.
Particularly to asylum seekers, an individual has to flee for an innumerable amount of reasons. Particularly if they're fleeing persecution, they're not oftentimes going to be able to obtain the requisite travel documents such as a passport. And that's especially the case if the persecutor in that that asylum seeker's particular country is the government. If the government official, for example, a state security officer or a police officer or someone in the army, is the actual persecutor of the individual, there's no way an individual is going to be able to obtain a government-issued document from the government if that entity is the one that's actually persecuting the individual. In addition, however, if an individual is fleeing, if the situation is so dire in that person's country and that person's facing imminent persecution or has suffered already past persecution and they have to flee immediately, they're not going to have the time to obtain documentation which will allow them, or documentation that would be considered valid.
Detention poses unique difficulties for asylum seekers.
An asylum seeker may have suffered some sort of physical past persecution, which is often the case, and they're dealing with the physical effects of that persecution. Maybe they were, beaten or some sort of physical harm, which can also result in psychological effects for the individual. That person is in a county jail. Not only is it hard for them to communicate with the outside world or understand what's going on around them, but they also have these needs, medical needs, that are not really attended to when they are in immigration detention.
An asylum seeker who recently was released from detention but wishes to remain anonymous explains the toll detention can take.
Because now I have freedom, I'm supposed to be happy, but what happened to my memory? And I can't sit down because I scared. Like first day I released, I talked with my friend, I still whisper, and my friend told me that now you are out of jail already, you don't need to be whisper.
In addition to the lack of medical and psychological care, detained immigrants and asylum seekers often do not have access to legal counsel.
Immigrants in removal proceedings in the United States do not have the right to court-appointed counsel. They have a right to counsel in their proceedings, but not to have one appointed if they can't afford one or they can't obtain one on their own. So it's a very different situation than the criminal setting, where if you're indigent, you can have you have the right to court-appointed counsel. So asylum seekers have to try and, from detention, find someone to represent them if they can't afford someone, or if they don't have anyone they know or ties to anyone. They have to basically seek counsel on their own. And our argument has always been that this effectively prevents asylum seekers from being able to obtain representation, because you're not denying them that right, but you're basically preventing them from being able to access an attorney. There's never, in my experience, a really good explanation of how to use the phones, other than by sort of word of mouth and oral tradition and camaraderie in the jails, where other detainees will help that person navigate the system. But for individuals who don't have that or can't communicate, it's really difficult to try and obtain legal counsel. There's statistics that show that individuals who present their asylum claims before the immigration courts with representation have a higher chance of prevailing on their claims than individuals who go unrepresented.
3 times in 2006, 2007, and 2008, the bipartisan Secure and Safe Detention and Asylum Act was introduced in the U.S. Senate in an attempt to restore fundamental rights to asylum seekers. Unfortunately, the bill has yet to pass Congress. The National Immigrant Justice Center continues to advocate for this and other legislation that protects the rights of asylum seekers and immigrants. Director Mary Meg McCarthy says it's important for Americans to understand this process from an immigrant's perspective.
I think oftentimes that in the U.S. we need to think about how we'd like to be treated if we were in another country who recognized these laws and standards. And we're attempting to comply, and yet their compliance really was not complete and in a sense violated rights. So when you look back on what our country's done in terms of how we've treated human beings who have sought protection or safe haven, I think we're going to be very embarrassed and think, why did we treat that person that way?